Hi guys, let's take a look at this powerful exchange where Dyer breaks down the deity of Jesus to an agnostic with thoughtful precision. What begins as a challenging debate takes a beautiful and unexpected turn by the end. You won't want to miss this eye-opening conversation.
I just had some questions. I've seen some of your stuff. I'm kind of in a tight position right now. I'd say I'm like more in like an agnostic position.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's on your mind?
I think my biggest question would have to be with the authenticity of the Bible. I've watched a lot of different debates, different opinions. Like, some people saying that the disciples didn't write the Gospels. The only evidence for Jesus' resurrection is Paul's accounts in the New Testaments where he mentions like one time, and some people bringing up like good arguments that Jesus might have not have been who he is. So yeah, that's like kind of in this spot. I want to believe in it, I really do, but these doubts are holding me back, and then some personal issues as well.
So when you say Jesus might not have been who he is, what does that mean? What do you mean?
Well, like there's some people that don't believe I know Bart Ehrman keeps on saying like he never claimed himself to be God, and it really is manuscripts of the Gospels.
Okay, well, have you read any of the Gospels?
I tried them once, yes.
Okay. So in the book of John, which is one of the earliest manuscripts that we have, the fragments of the Gospel of John, every chapter of the Gospel of John, he claims to be God, and there's some reference to the Trinity.
I know, like John 8:58, John 10:30.
No, every
John
chapter.
14:7.
Every chapter.
Every chapter.
Yeah.
Claims. I guess my question would be like, if he wanted to make it obvious, like, why doesn't he just say like, I am God?
He does like many times over in the Gospel of John.
Could you give me like one example?
John 1.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. But isn't that John writing it, not Jesus writing it?
Well, how do you know that we're only supposed to listen to the words in red? I mean, the text later on says that Jesus inspired John to write those things.
That the Bible is God-inspired. Is that your reference you're pointing to?
Well, that's one text that says that, but Peter says that it was the Spirit of Christ who spake through the apostles, the prophets, etc. I mean, in John 5, Jesus says that he has all power and authority in heaven and earth. He has the same power and honor as the Father. Everyone should honor the Son equally as they honor the Father. Is that not divinity to say that you should worship me the same as you worship the Father?
It is.
Okay,
it
so
is, John, you're referring to
John 5:23.
John 5:23, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the same passage, right, he says that he has the ability to raise the entire world at the end of the world.
Yeah. He calls himself the Almighty. He calls himself the first and the last.
He says, before Abraham was, I am. That's referring to Exodus 3, the burning bush. So, I mean, literally every chapter of the Gospel of John has some reference to his deity.
If he, like, the purpose of, like, that verse, like, if he wanted to prove that he was, like, the I am, Yahweh says to Moses in Exodus, how come he doesn't say like before like Adam? Because there's a lot of people before Moses, or like Abraham.
Because in the context, the context is the Pharisees arguing about Moses and Abraham. He says, you trust in Moses, but Moses wrote about me. If you believe what Moses wrote, you would believe in me. And he says, before Abraham was, I am. Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. That means that he's the one that is there in Genesis talking to Abraham, having a meal with him in Genesis 16. He's the one in Exodus 33 on the top of the mountain eating with Moses. That's what he's saying, because he had just said to the Pharisees, no one sees the Father at any time. So the question is, well, then who was Moses face to face talking to? Because Exodus said he was talking to God face to face. Well, if it's not the Father, Jesus is saying, who else could it be?
He's talking to the Son.
He's saying it's me. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So it was Jesus that was speaking to Moses at the burning bush, not the Father?
Correct. Well, that's what Jesus is arguing to the Pharisees. He says, if we agree that no one saw the Father, then who was Moses talking to?
Okay. But why does it say before Abraham and not before Moses? I'm a little confused on that.
Because the Pharisees were talking about Abraham. They were saying, we are the children of Abraham. And so Jesus is countering by referring to their example and saying, before Abraham was, I am.
Okay.
And see that I am is Exodus 3, the burning bush I am.
Okay. With John, John 7 and John 8, I'm not saying that I think this is true, but I've heard some people saying that, like, the story of the adulterous woman is not actually real. Like, John 8 was, like, fabricated. It's not, like, it wasn't part of, like, the true.
That's not true. Yeah, I did a whole podcast with a New Testament scholar on that. His name's James Snap, and we went through the codices that do include that section of John. So you could watch that if you want more information on that. But in the Orthodox Church, we follow, for the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and for the New Testament, the received text. It's not that we have a problem with all the other ones. They can be additional attestations to our view. But that's the traditional text that we follow. We don't necessarily follow something just because it's older. Older doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. You can have error that's older than anything else. So old can be, you can have older preserved error as well. So, and we do have code. If I recall, this was a podcast I did with that guy like maybe 5 years ago. There are codices, especially the received text, that do include that section of John. So it really depends on whether you believe the church has the authority within history and the tradition of the church has the authority to maintain the texts and tell you who wrote them. So at the very beginning you mentioned, well, we don't know.
But isn't the... Sorry to cut you off.
No, this addresses your point at the very beginning when you said, well, how do we know the apostles wrote something like Matthew? Well, we don't. That's the point. We don't know that Matthew the apostle wrote the book of Matthew without the tradition of the church, and that's why we're not Protestants, for example.
So the church fathers, like, you accept that they were, like, followers of the original apostles, and they were convinced that the disciples wrote the Gospels. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in other words, you can't divorce the text from the tradition of the church like most Protestants want to do. So, in other words, I would grant to you that, it's true that the text of Matthew itself doesn't tell you. And even if you read the Orthodox Study Bible, the notes point out the very first thing it says, the Gospel of Matthew does not name Matthew as the author. It is tradition in certain manuscripts that say that it is a Matthew who is identified as one of the 12. So the text itself doesn't tell you that. It's tradition. So what I'm saying is that objection by Bart Ehrman or whoever, that might be an objection to a Protestant. But if you believe that there is church tradition, then it's not really a problem for us. You would have to then, sort of refute the idea that there is such a thing as church tradition that's reliable or whatever.
So the fact of, like, sola scriptura is, like, the only way that, like, the argument of, like, the disciples writing the Gospels could, like, technically be debunked. Is that what you're saying? Because the Protestants don't uphold to the belief of, like, church tradition. They don't believe in sola scriptura.
Right. So Protestantism is premised on ultimately the authority of the text alone. Right. That's the final authority.
Yeah.
So
but that doesn't really make any sense.
No, it doesn't, and we would agree that it's true that, like, Matthew doesn't tell you who wrote it. So you need tradition, and a lot more educated Protestants, like if you look at somebody like Lee MacDonald's book on the canon or F.F. Bruce's book on the canon, like, they'll admit, at some point tradition is necessary. So even the top Protestants kind of admit that at a certain point.
Okay. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I don't know if you've ever heard of this denomination before. Have you heard of what Marthama is?
I have not. Mm-mm.
It was based upon the church that St. Thomas found in India.
Okay.
I think it's like an Assyrian church, Light of the Nations. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I've heard of the Indian St. Thomas Christians. I've heard of that.
Okay, so I was raised in that church. I never believed in it. I just went to church because my parents made me go, but I never thought to reason like why was that so true. And I haven't been to that church in so many years because I have, my mom and I. My mom had really traumatic events happen in that church, so we had to leave because of that. And I just don't find. Yeah. I'm trying to go back, but I just don't find myself finding any growth in there personally or spiritually, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend that group at all. But I would say if you're interested in continuing on this issue, I do have lectures through the entirety of the Gospel of John. And what I try to demonstrate in those lectures is that every chapter of the Gospel of John, as an example, refers to the deity of Christ and or the Trinity. So you might want to check that out to see if, there's a consistent kind of pattern here for what's going on.